At exactly 5:03 in the morning, 3 hard knocks shook the front door of my quiet house, and when I opened it, I found my newly divorced ex-wife standing barefoot on the porch, clutching a sealed envelope against her chest as though it contained the last remaining piece of her life. Her hair was damp with morning mist, her pale blue sweater was buttoned incorrectly, and her eyes looked more frightened than they had on the day our own marriage ended. I had spent almost 6 years teaching myself not to care what happened to her, but the moment she whispered that she had nowhere else to go, every wall I had built inside me began to crack. Then she looked past me into the empty hallway and said she had come to confess something that would either make me hate her forever or change everything between us. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Dream Discipline if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the courage it takes to forgive someone who once broke your heart. My name is Callum Reeves, and until that morning, I believed I had finally made peace with the past. I lived alone in a modest white house on the edge of Cedar Hollow, a small town surrounded by wheat fields, narrow roads, and long stretches of open sky. I restored old furniture for a living, mostly tables, cabinets, and rocking chairs that people could not bear to throw away. There was something comforting about taking an object everyone thought was ruined and slowly uncovering what was still good underneath. I never admitted it, but I think I chose that work because I wanted proof that broken things could become useful again, even when people could not. My marriage to Maris Ellington had ended 6 years earlier, not with screaming or betrayal, but with a silence so deep it became impossible to cross. We had loved each other when we were young, when life was smaller and hope was cheaper. We married at 25, rented a crooked little house near the river, and spent weekends eating burnt pancakes and planning a future that seemed certain to arrive. But plans changed after we lost our first child late in the pregnancy, and grief settled inside our home like dust. We stopped touching, then stopped talking, and eventually stopped looking at each other at all. Maris buried herself in work. I buried myself in anger. One cold afternoon, she placed divorce papers on the kitchen table and told me she could no longer breathe in the life we had built. I signed them without asking her to stay. That decision followed me for years. After our divorce, Maris moved to another city and married a real estate developer named Vaughn Mercer. I heard about the wedding through mutual friends. He was wealthy, polished, and confident, the kind of man who appeared in newspaper photographs beside ribbon cuttings and charity checks. I told myself I was glad she had found someone who could give her a clean life untouched by our old sadness. Still, whenever her name surfaced, I felt a familiar ache beneath my ribs. I never remarried. I came close once, but I could not give another woman the part of me that had remained frozen in the past. Then, 2 weeks before that early morning knock, I learned that Maris and Vaughn had finalized their divorce. I did not ask why. I had become good at pretending that her choices no longer mattered to me. Standing in my doorway at dawn, however, Maris did not look like the distant, successful woman people described. She looked exhausted, ashamed, and utterly alone. The first gray light of morning was beginning to spread across the street, revealing dew on the grass and a thin layer of fog over the fields. I stepped aside and let her enter. She walked into the living room slowly, as though afraid the house itself might reject her. Her eyes moved across the familiar things that had once belonged to both of us, the oak bookshelf we bought at a flea market, the brass lamp she had always hated, and the faded photograph of my parents near the window. She sat on the edge of the sofa but did not remove her coat. I made coffee because it was easier than asking why she had come. While the kettle heated, I watched her reflection in the kitchen window. She kept turning the envelope over in her hands, rubbing one thumb along the sealed edge. When I finally sat across from her, she told me her divorce from Vaughn had not happened because of money, cruelty, or another woman. It had happened because she had spent nearly 5 years protecting a lie. Her voice trembled as she explained that her marriage had looked perfect from the outside, but it had been built on guilt. Vaughn had loved her honestly, she said, and she had tried to love him with the same completeness. Yet every important moment in their life had reminded her of something unfinished between us. On their first anniversary, she had cried in the bathroom because the restaurant played the song from our wedding. When they bought a house, she chose one with a porch like the home we once planned to build. When Vaughn asked why she never wanted children, she told him she had changed her mind, but the truth was that fear had taken root after our loss. She could not imagine surviving that pain again. Over time, Vaughn realized that part of her heart belonged to a life she refused to discuss. Their marriage became another quiet house full of unanswered questions. I listened without interrupting, but anger began rising in me. I had spent years believing she had escaped our broken marriage and found happiness elsewhere. Now she was sitting in my house telling me she had carried our past into another man's life. It felt unfair to everyone involved. I asked why she had come to me instead of a friend or family member. Her hands tightened around the envelope. Then she said something that turned the room completely still. She told me that after our baby died, she had received information from the hospital that she never shared with me. The envelope contained a copy of the original letter. For a moment, I could hear nothing except the clock ticking on the wall. Maris placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. She explained that several weeks after the loss, the hospital had contacted her about additional test results. The doctors believed the complications had been caused by a rare but treatable clotting condition. With proper monitoring and medication, future pregnancies could have been carried safely. I stared at her, unable to understand what she was saying. During the worst months of our grief, we had believed the loss was likely to happen again. That fear had shaped everything. It had made us afraid to dream, afraid to try, and afraid to speak honestly. Yet she had known there was hope. Maris began crying before she finished her explanation. She admitted that she had hidden the letter because she had been terrified. She could not face another pregnancy, another hospital room, another tiny life slipping away. She believed that telling me would create hope, and hope would create pressure. She feared I would want to try again before she was ready. Instead of trusting me with the truth, she let me believe our future as parents had ended. When I grew bitter and distant, she convinced herself that leaving was easier than confessing. She kept the letter through our divorce, through her second marriage, and through every year that followed. The guilt eventually destroyed her ability to be close to anyone. I stood and walked toward the window because I could not bear to look at her. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, turning the fog golden over the fields. A delivery truck moved slowly along the road. Somewhere nearby, birds were waking in the trees. The world looked ordinary, and that made the truth feel even more unbearable. I thought about the nights after our baby died, when I had sat alone in the unfinished nursery believing Maris no longer wanted a family with me. I remembered the arguments, the closed doors, the divorce papers. I remembered blaming myself for not being strong enough to save our marriage. All those years, one hidden letter had sat in a drawer while our lives moved in separate directions. My first instinct was to tell her to leave. I wanted to punish her with the same silence she had once used against me. I wanted her to carry the full weight of what she had done. But when I turned around, I saw that she was not asking to be forgiven. She was sitting with her shoulders bent, waiting for the consequences. She said she had not come because she expected us to reunite. She had come because Vaughn, during their final conversation, told her that she would never be free until she faced the person most harmed by her fear. She had driven through the early morning because she knew that if she waited until daylight, courage would abandon her again. I told her I needed air, and we walked outside as the morning brightened. The porch boards were cold beneath my feet. Maris slipped on an old pair of shoes I kept near the door, and we followed the gravel path toward the workshop behind my house. The fields beyond the fence shimmered under the rising sun. Inside the workshop stood a damaged wooden cradle I had purchased months earlier from an estate sale. Its side rail was cracked, the paint was peeling, and one of the rockers had split. I had avoided restoring it because every time I looked at it, I thought of the child we lost. Maris stopped when she saw it. Her face tightened, and for a long time neither of us moved. She finally walked toward the cradle and placed her hand on the broken rail. She said she had imagined our child growing up thousands of times. She imagined first steps, school mornings, scraped knees, and birthdays. She had even imagined what our child might have looked like at 6 years old, then 10, then 16. Her grief had never disappeared. It had only changed shape. I felt my anger shift, not vanish, but become mixed with something heavier. I understood that she had not hidden the letter because she felt nothing. She had hidden it because she felt too much and lacked the courage to share the weight. We spent the next several hours in the workshop. The morning became bright and warm, and sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. I did not forgive her that day. Forgiveness is not a door that opens because someone knocks once. It is more like restoring damaged wood, removing one layer at a time and discovering which parts can still hold weight. But I listened. Maris told me about her failed marriage, her panic attacks, and the years she spent avoiding hospitals, baby showers, and even certain streets because memories overwhelmed her. I told her about my loneliness, my resentment, and the relationship I had ended because I could not allow myself to love someone new. For the first time since our child died, we spoke about everything without protecting ourselves. Around midday, Maris said she would leave. She had booked a room at a motel outside town and planned to stay only long enough to arrange her next steps. She had recently resigned from the company she built with Vaughn and did not know where she belonged anymore. Before she left the workshop, she placed the hospital letter beside the cradle and said I could keep it, burn it, or throw it away. The choice was mine. I watched her walk toward the house, and something inside me recognized the familiar pattern. Once again, pain was pushing us in opposite directions. Once again, silence was about to make a decision for both of us. I followed her to the driveway and told her she could stay in the guest room for a few days, but only under one condition. We would not pretend the confession had fixed anything. We would not rush toward romance, forgiveness, or promises. We would speak honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Maris nodded with tears in her eyes. For the first time that morning, her face showed something other than fear. It showed relief. The days that followed were quiet but different from the silence of our marriage. We ate breakfast on the porch while the sun rose over the fields. Maris helped organize receipts in the workshop and answered calls from customers. I taught her how to sand old varnish without damaging the grain. She laughed the first time she ruined a brush, and the sound startled me because it reminded me of who she had been before grief changed us. We also argued. I asked hard questions. She did not defend herself or make excuses. Some afternoons she drove into town to meet a counselor. Other afternoons I joined her, and together we began untangling years of guilt, anger, and unspoken sorrow. A week later, we returned to the broken cradle. Restoring it became our shared task. We replaced the cracked rail, repaired the rocker, stripped away the old paint, and polished the wood until the original maple grain appeared beneath the damage. Neither of us talked about what the cradle represented. We simply worked beside each other in the daylight, sometimes speaking, sometimes crying, and sometimes allowing the steady sound of sandpaper to fill the space between us. One afternoon, a young couple entered the workshop looking for furniture for the baby they were expecting. They could not afford anything new, and the husband asked whether the cradle was for sale. Maris looked at me, and I understood what she was asking without words. We gave it to them. The young woman touched the smooth wooden rail and began to cry when we told her there was no charge. Watching them carry the cradle into their car, I felt something inside me loosen. We could not change what had happened to our child, but the love we never had the chance to give did not have to remain trapped inside us. Months passed. Maris found work with a local housing charity that helped single parents repair unsafe homes. She rented a small cottage near the library instead of remaining in my guest room. We continued counseling and met for coffee several times each week. Slowly, we became friends again. Then, almost a year after the morning she knocked on my door, we stood together at a community fundraiser beneath a bright spring sky. She told me she had learned that regret could not be erased, but it could be transformed into honesty, service, and compassion. I told her I still loved her, though the love was no longer the desperate, wounded feeling I had carried for years. It was quieter now, built not on memory but on the people we were becoming. We did not remarry immediately. We dated carefully, asked questions we should have asked long ago, and learned how to stay present when fear told us to run. 2 years after her confession, we exchanged vows in my parents' garden on a clear afternoon. There were no expensive decorations, no large crowd, and no attempt to recreate the wedding we once had. We promised something simpler: to tell the truth before silence could grow between us. Later, we became foster parents to a 9-year-old girl named Tamsin who had spent most of her life moving between temporary homes. She arrived carrying one suitcase and a deep suspicion of promises. Maris never pressured her to trust us. She understood better than anyone that safety had to be proven slowly. I built Tamsin a desk from reclaimed oak, and Maris helped her paint the walls of her bedroom a soft green. Months later, Tamsin asked whether she could call our house home. That was the moment I understood that second chances do not always restore the future we once imagined. Sometimes they create a different future, one that is not lesser, only unexpected. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Dream Discipline. Your support helps stories of forgiveness, healing, kindness, and second chances reach people who may desperately need hope today. Just before we end, please comment, "Truth can heal what silence broke," as a reminder that even the most painful confession can become the first step toward a better life. The envelope Maris brought that morning remains in a locked drawer in my workshop, but I no longer think of it as the letter that destroyed our marriage. I think of it as the truth that arrived late but not too late. At 5:03 on a quiet morning, my past stood barefoot on my porch asking to be heard. I could have closed the door. For years, I believed that would have been strength. Now I know that sometimes the bravest thing a wounded person can do is leave the door open long enough for honesty to enter.